On August 20th, 1947, Major Onkar Singh Gulgit of the British Indian Army was serving as Brigade Major in Northwest Frontier Province in current Pakistan. While his commanding officer, Brigadier Murray, was away, Major Gulgit received an envelope marked Top Secret on Murray's behalf. There he found the detailed plan of Operation Gulmarg. He read through the plan and was left shocked. Gulgit quickly called Brigadier Murray, who told him not to breathe a word to anyone, or he would not be allowed to leave Pakistan alive. Soon after that, Gulgit was placed under house arrest. He made a daring escape from his house arrest in Pakistan and made his way to New Delhi almost 2 months later in October of 1947. He told the Indian authorities about the details of an imminent attack coming in Kashmir, codenamed Operation Gulmarg. Named after the town Gulmarg in current Kashmir of northern India, Operation Gulmarg was the plan created by Pakistani defense and political establishment to invade Kashmir in October of 1947. The prime objective of the operation was to use Pakistani non-state tribal forces to quickly capture the capital of Jammu and Kashmir, Srinagar, and after that, annex the whole state. Right after the independence of India from colonial British rule, various autonomous provinces were given the option of either joining the Union of India or the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. The Hindu and Sikh majority provinces joined India, while the Muslim majority provinces joined Pakistan. The state of Jammu and Kashmir was a Muslim majority state with a Hindu ruler who wanted to neither join India nor Pakistan. He wanted to create an independent country. While negotiations were continuing between India, Pakistan, and Jammu and Kashmir, the Pakistani side planned the operation to take the state by force. The invasion and annexation of Kashmir was planned in 2 phases. Phase 1, distraction. The dispersion of Jammu and Kashmir state forces into smaller groups as a diversionary tactic. In this phase, the Pakistani establishment planned to organize raids all across Kashmir through its proxies within all major cities and towns in the state. This would disperse the Jammu and Kashmir defense forces into smaller pockets, and while the state forces are spread out responding to these raids, the main attack would happen along the main highways, and in a swift action, they will capture all major targets. Phase 2, invasion. Assemble irregular militia and tribal units from the northwest frontier province of Pakistan and concentrate them along Pakistan-Kashmir border lines, and with the support of the Pakistani military, carry out the invasion. This would give the Pakistani establishment the option of denying any involvement in the operation. The assumptions in this operation were that there was no way the already dispersed and considerably weak Jammu and Kashmir state forces could defend against a planned attack of a very high magnitude. The distance from the Pakistani border, where the invasion force was to be assembled, and the capital Srinagar was only 170 kilometers, so it was expected to be captured within 4 to 5 days of the invasion. The sudden attack and swift action would ensure that the Indian forces would not have enough time to intervene before the capital Srinagar is captured. The invasion was planned along 3 fronts: the Srinagar front, the Jammu front, and the Gilgit front. Each front had 10 tribal units, each unit 1,000 soldiers strong. The Srinagar front. 10 units were to advance along the towns of Muzaffarabad, Domil, Uri and Baramula with the specific objective of capturing Srinagar. Jammu front. Another force of 10 units were to operate in the Poonch, Bhimber and Rawalkot area with the intention of capturing Poonch and Rajouri and then capturing Jammu. Gilgit front. More forces were assembled using the soldiers from the northwest frontier province as well as local militia in the Gilgit-Baltistan area with the objective of capturing Gilgit, Skardu, Kargil and Leh. The task was to assemble approximately 20,000 irregular tribal soldiers as the invading force and form them into 20 tribal units for the Srinagar and Jammu front. Each tribal unit was provided with one major and 10 junior commission officers, JCOs, from the regular Pakistani army dressed as tribals. The assigned major acted as an advisor to the tribal head of each unit. The entire force was commanded by Major General Akbar Khan of the Pakistani army, codenamed Tariq. The D-Day of the invasion was fixed for October 22, 1947. All tribal units were covertly concentrated in Abbottabad by October 18, 1947. On October 21st, Pakistan's 7th Infantry was on standby near Abbottabad to provide backup to the tribal invasion and consolidate their hold on the valley. Everything was in place for the invasion of Kashmir for October 22, 1947. All assets from the Pakistani side were in place near Abbottabad on October 21, 1947. The D-Day for the invasion of Kashmir was October 22nd, with the first objective of capturing the capital of Jammu and Kashmir, Srinagar, within 5 days of the invasion. Capturing Srinagar within the 5-day time frame was very crucial for the enemy, because any longer would have given enough breathing room to the Jammu and Kashmir state forces and the state government to reach out for reinforcements. As planned, the first assault by approximately 10,000 tribal invading forces came in the morning of October 22, 1947. The first major contact of the tribal invading force with the Jammu and Kashmir state forces happened the next day in the town of Muzaffarabad. As expected by the enemy, the invasion caught the Jammu and Kashmir state forces completely by surprise, as they had no intelligence of an attack coming in. The towns of Domil and Muzaffarabad fell to the invaders very quickly. The two-phase approach of the enemy seemed to be working as planned. The phase 1 of the operation distraction of spreading out the defense forces in penny pockets had worked. Now the next step for the invaders was to continue with the momentum and capture Srinagar within the planned 5-day time frame. After the fall of Muzaffarabad, the next town along the highway, Uri, was well within reach of the enemy. The news of the sudden invasion reached Srinagar on October 24, 1947. The Jammu and Kashmir state forces, led by Brigadier Rajendra Singh, rallied all the troops available in Srinagar to defend against the invasion. Their objective was to save the capital at any cost, by either successfully stopping the invading force or slowing down their advance enough to buy time for reinforcements. In this short period of time, with many of the state troops dispersed out, the first of defense troops they could gather were only 200. The brigadier and his 200 troops left the capital to stop the invasion. Upon reaching Uri on October 24th, Brigadier Singh deployed a platoon to secure a major connecting bridge on the highway and rushed forward towards Muzaffarabad to engage the enemy troops. After inflicting some losses on the enemy, he made a retreat towards Uri with the rest of his troops and settled himself at a strong point on the other side of the bridge. When the enemy started mobilizing on the other end of the bridge and were about to cross it, they blew it apart with explosives. The destruction of this bridge in Uri, which was the only motorable road leading to Srinagar, slowed down the enemy's advance for one whole day. However, by the next day, October 26th, the enemy found a footbridge to cross over the river and enter the outskirts of Uri. They started building their numbers around Uri to try and encircle the defense troops. They launched multiple waves of attacks at the defense positions throughout the day, but all the attacks were repelled by the defense forces. Despite being outnumbered 1 to 20 against the invading force and suffering heavy losses, the brigadier's 200 troops held the defense lines at Uri for 2 days, October 25th and October 26th of 1947. These 2 days were very crucial in the grand scheme of things, because it was these 2 days that bought just enough time for the state representatives of Jammu and Kashmir to fly to New Delhi and negotiate a deal of accession of the state of Jammu and Kashmir over to the Union of India. Once the accession was signed, only then could India send in their troops for the defense of the valley. The brigadier's defense troops had succeeded in slowing down the invasion for the accession to go through and for reinforcements from the Indian army to start arriving in Srinagar. By October 27, 1947, Brigadier Singh and his men had suffered heavy losses and were running short of ammunition. As a result of that, the enemy had started breaking into their defense lines. So they decided to retreat towards Baramula, the previous town along the highway. In an attack from the enemy during this move, on October 27th, Brigadier Rajendra Singh lost his life. For the success of his operation and the bravery he showed during this challenging mission, Brigadier Rajendra Singh was posthumously awarded the Mahavir Chakra, India's second highest military honor. While Brigadier Rajendra Singh's troops fought the invaders from October 24th to October 26th to try and delay the capture of Srinagar, the Jammu and Kashmir state representatives negotiated the instrument of accession of their state over to the Union of India. The instrument of accession was signed in the evening of October 26, 1947. Within a couple of hours of the signing, at 5 a.m. of October 27th, the first of Indian troops were dispatched from New Delhi over to Srinagar. While Brigadier Rajendra Singh's troops fought the invaders from October 24th to October 26th to try and delay the capture of Srinagar, the Jammu and Kashmir state representatives negotiated the instrument of accession of their state over to the Union of India. The instrument of accession was signed in the evening of October 26, 1947. Within a couple of hours of the signing, at 5 a.m. of October 27th, the first of Indian troops were dispatched from New Delhi over to Srinagar. The troops were from the regiment 1 Sikh, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Diwan Ranjit Rai. The orders for Colonel Rai were to land into Srinagar airfield, hold the airfield at any cost until reinforcements arrive. Access to the airfield was very crucial from the Indian Army's standpoint, because this was the only way reinforcements could arrive into Srinagar quickly and continuously throughout the war.
7 a.m. October 27, 1947. There was no local intelligence for the troops to know whether or not Srinagar airport was even in friendly control. The first flight of the Indian troops circled around the airfield for some time to ensure it was safe to land. It turned out that the airfield was in fact under friendly control, and the first of Indian troops safely landed in Srinagar. The remainder of the Sikh battalion was flown in later that day. The first of Indian troops had arrived in Srinagar on October 27, 1947. Meanwhile, after defeating the troops of Jammu and Kashmir state forces by October 27th, the tribal forces had absolutely no obstacles capturing the next town along the highway, Baramula, only 52 kilometers away. And thereafter, their final target, Srinagar, 64 kilometers from Baramula. Despite losing 2 days at Uri, they still had a chance of entering as well as capturing Srinagar by the end of the day of the 27th within their 5-day time frame. But after entering the prosperous town of Baramula, the raiders, instead of swiftly moving ahead with their plan of capturing Srinagar, chose to stay in Baramula for the next 2 days to loot and pillage. This was a huge tactical mistake by the enemy because the whole operation depended upon a swift capture of Srinagar, and they lost valuable time plundering and pillaging the town of Baramula. Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, in his book India's Wars, writes, "With very little protection, the prosperous town of Baramula bore the brunt of the raiders' greed and lust as the tribals halted their advance, ransacking the town over the next 2 days. This tactical error by the enemy gave Colonel Rai and his unit the necessary bandwidth to enter Srinagar and strengthen their defensive positions by the evening of the 27th. After setting the defensive positions, Colonel Rai, with one company of 1 Sikh, went towards Baramula on the night of October 27. This was to reinforce their defense on the west of Srinagar and set up an outer layer of defense to the capital. After making initial contact with the enemy, Colonel Rai decided to make a tactical withdrawal towards the high ground near Patan, 21 kilometers west of Srinagar. The Indian troops were still heavily outnumbered compared to the invading force, so the decision was made to take advantage of the higher grounds of Patan to hold the enemy advance into Srinagar. During the company's withdrawal from the outskirts of Baramula towards Patan, Colonel Rai was caught in a machine gun crossfire and lost his life. He was posthumously awarded the Mahavir Chakra. Taking advantage of the high grounds near Patan, the Indian armed forces successfully blocked the enemy from advancing further towards Srinagar along the highway. The initial plan of capturing Srinagar by October 27 within the 5-day time frame had failed. The enemy made repeated attempts to break the block of Patan, but they were unsuccessful in that effort. Seeing the futile efforts of continuing to engage along the highway, the enemy made a change in their plan. Instead of concentrating all their attack force along the highway towards Srinagar, the enemy split themselves in 2 attack elements. One that continued their attack along the highway to keep the pressure on the forces defending Srinagar, and the other that diverted south towards the airfields of Budgam. This was a smart plan because the capture of these airfields would have denied the Indian armed forces the ability to dispatch the much needed reinforcements to Srinagar. And after capturing the airfield and blocking the immediate arrival of more Indian troops, the enemy would have taken advantage of their numerical superiority in the region and captured Srinagar in the coming weeks. So for the Indian armed forces, protecting these airfields was very crucial to sustain the defense of the valley. It is also important to understand that at this point in the war, the strength of the Indian armed forces in Srinagar wasn't large. Most of the troops were deployed in the protection of Srinagar. Very few troops could be spared even for this crucial mission. To protect the airfields of Pargam, the army base from Srinagar sent in 50 men from Fort Kumaon. This was under the command of Major Somnath Sharma. Major Sharma and his men were outnumbered 1:7 against the enemy. They fought in close quarters during the battle and suffered very heavy casualties. Despite heavy losses, Major Sharma's team repelled the enemy attack on the airfield and saved it from being captured. The airfields would remain in control of the Indian armed forces for the remainder of the war. Major Sharma played a crucial role in achieving his mission but lost his life during the battle. His last message to his unit was, "The enemy are only 50 yards away from us. We are heavily outnumbered. We are under devastating fire. I shall not withdraw an inch, but will fight to the last man and the last round." For his bravery and sacrifice in the battle, Major Somnath Sharma was posthumously awarded the Paramveer Chakra, India's highest military honor. Till this point in the war, the Indian armed forces had been in a reactive mode where they were responding to the moves made by the invaders with their countermeasures. But now, with the airfields secured and some presence built up in Srinagar, the Indian armed forces took the fight to the invaders to repel them from Srinagar once and for all. This happened 18 kilometers west of Srinagar, in the town of Shalateng. The invaders in the previous few days had started spreading themselves out of the highway into smaller groups. The Indian side was concerned that with the enemy forces spread out, they may resort to guerrilla tactics which may prolong the defense effort of Srinagar. They preferred to fight the enemy in a conventional battle setting. This is why Brigadier L.P. Sen, the commander of the 161 Brigade of Indian Armed Forces, took the highly risky decision of withdrawing the troops of 1 Sikh from Patan to Shalateng. The plan was to let the enemy see the troops retreating from their strong positions at Patan and opening the blockade. Seeing an opportunity to capture Srinagar, their primary objective, the enemy would again concentrate their forces back on the highway and attack Srinagar in a conventional battle setting. So on November 4th, Brigadier Sen gave the order to withdraw 1 Sikh from their strong positions near Patan. By November 6th, the troops were in position for the battle. 2 companies of 1 Sikh, 1 company of 1 Kumaon, and 1 troop of armored cars of 7 cavalry were holding the enemy lines west of Srinagar. By the morning of November 7th, thousands of raiders had concentrated near Shalateng and had started firing at the 1 Sikh positions. It was clear that they were going to launch a major attack into Srinagar. 1 Sikh was to defend against the frontal assault. 1 Kumaon, that was positioned behind 1 Sikh, was ordered to move on the right flank of the enemy, and the surprise attack plan was to send the armored cars of 7 cavalry along a little known path from the north of Srinagar that connected the main Srinagar highway at the rear of Shalateng. The plan was to outflank the raiders' position and while they focus on moving forward towards Srinagar, catch them from behind. 1 Sikh engaged the frontal assault, and as soon as 7 cavalry and 1 Kumaon were in position, Brigadier Sen ordered the attack to go in. The Indian armed forces fired into the enemy concentrations from 3 sides. 1 Sikh on the frontal assault, 1 Kumaon from the right, and 7 cavalry from behind. The attack from 3 directions shocked the enemy, and within 20 minutes of the attack, they started to retreat from their positions back towards Baramula. Once there was a clear demarcation between the raiders withdrawing away from Srinagar and the Indian armed forces pursuing them, the Air Force sent in their Tempest and Spitfire aircrafts on the retreating enemy, ensuring their rout from the region. The Indian side continued with their pursuit of the enemy and liberated Baramula on November 8, 1947. They then liberated Uri on November 13, 1947. The Indian Armed Forces wanted to continue with its momentum and push the raiders completely out of the Kashmir Valley. That's when the news came of a major town in the south that needed urgent rescue. The enemy's assault along the Jammu front was underway, and their forces were about to capture the major town of Poonch.
Previously, we saw how the main attack plan of the enemy of capturing the capital of Jammu and Kashmir, Srinagar, had failed because the Indian armed forces reached just in time to stop the invasion. After the decisive battle of Shalateng, the enemy had to retreat from its strongholds from the outskirts of Srinagar, Baramula, and Uri. The Indian armed forces were in the process of continuing to push the enemy out of the valley by recapturing Domil and Muzaffarabad. That is when they heard the news of the second wave of invasions in the south of the valley. The enemy had launched their second wave of attack in the southern side with the objective of capturing Jammu. If they were successful in this effort, then they would have been able to cut off the Kashmir Valley from the rest of India, making the Indian defense of the valley even more challenging in the long run. So it was extremely crucial for the Indian side to stop the enemy from capturing Jammu. This assault happened on multiple fronts along the Jammu-Poonch line. The plan was to capture all major towns along this line till the enemy reached Jammu. The towns in the region under assault were Mirpur, Kotli, Naushera and Jhangar in the middle, Rajouri and Poonch towards the north of the sector, and the future plans were to attack Akhnur and Jammu on the southern side. Troops of the 50 Parachute Brigade were aggregated in Jammu to begin operations to reinforce these towns in the Poonch sector. While the reinforcements were to arrive in these towns, the Jammu and Kashmir State Force garrisons were the only troops available to defend against the ongoing enemy assault. There was no outside help that could be provided to these garrisons. One major challenge for the Indian armed forces was the long border they shared with the enemy in this region. So the enemy could attack multiple targets parallelly. Even in the case of major victories for the Indian armed forces, the enemy could always attack the next town down the communication line and with just one success, outflank the Indian positions and isolate them in the north. So the objective for the 50 Para Brigade was to move north from Jammu and provide relief to all these towns under assault, but at the same time ensure that the line of communication between Poonch and Jammu is secure. With the twofold objective of 50 Para Brigade, they had to push forward as quickly and forcefully as possible, but at the same time leave behind enough troops and resources in each town in order to secure the crucial line of communication. The enemy's initial plan was to overrun the towns in the region in quick succession. They did not expect the town defense forces to put up much of a fight under such an overwhelming assault. But to their surprise, the defense forces in the towns dug themselves in and fought back against the assault. With the enemy's plan foiled, they were forced to change their game plan and resort to siege tactics for each town. By October 28, 1947, Mirpur, Kotli and Poonch were under heavy attack from the enemy, and the enemy started to lay siege around these towns in the coming days. There was some air support that was provided to the defending garrisons in these towns, but the air support was not enough to reinforce the garrisons. The crucial town of Rajouri fell to the enemy. The towns of Jhangar and Naushera, already under heavy attack,
were also on the brink. 50 Para Brigade, in the meantime, sent their troops into the town of Akhnur as a prelude to their move into Jhangar, Kotli and Mirpur. Meanwhile, in the north, the 161 Brigade had liberated Uri on November 13th and was planning on continuing with their assault on the retreating enemy into Domil and Muzaffarabad when the news came in about the Poonch garrison being under heavy attack and in need of urgent relief. With this information, the Indian side altered their plans for the 161 Brigade and ordered them to move south to relieve the garrisons at Poonch. With this, the two-front approach to relieve the towns in the Poonch-Jammu line was created, with the 161 Brigade from the north and the 50 Para Brigade from the south. The plan of action was for the 50 Para Brigade, currently present at Akhnur, to move at high speed towards the north of the Jammu-Poonch line on November 16th. It was to secure Naushera on the same day, establish a firm base at Jhangar on November 17th, and relieve Kotli and Mirpur by November 18th and November 20th, 1947. While the 50 Para Brigade helps relieve the garrisons in these towns, in the north, the 161 Infantry Brigade was to strike from Uri on November 18th and arrive in Poonch on the same day. The Royal Indian Air Force detachment from Amritsar was to provide aerial support to the southern side. The attack went in as planned on November 17th, but 50 Para Brigade was slowed down in the initial few days due to large presence of enemies in the region. Instead of their plan of relieving Jhangar on November 17th, they reached that town on November 22nd. They also faced strong resistance in the Mirpur-Kotli region. Due to this fierce resistance, 50 Para Brigade could not reach the Mirpur garrison in time, and Mirpur fell on November 20th, 1947. Kotli fell shortly thereafter on November 28th, 1947. 50 Para Brigade was able to relieve the garrisons at Jhangar and Naushera. In the north, on November 20th, 1947, 161 Brigade sent in a portion of their troops to relieve Poonch, while others stayed back to hold Uri. The troops going south were divided in two sections. The advance party under Brigadier Pritam Singh was able to cross the crucial Haji Pir Pass in the way and make link with the Poonch garrison. The second section, unfortunately, was ambushed by the enemy and suffered heavy casualties. They had to retreat back towards Uri. Subsequent reinforcements attempts from Uri could not break through the enemy over to Poonch. The enemy, with their heavy concentrations in the region, occupied all the important features around Poonch and laid the siege on the town. Poonch garrison, with troops from Jammu and Kashmir state forces, reinforced by troops under Brigadier Pritam Singh, formed the Poonch Brigade. The one-year-long siege of Poonch began by the end of November 1947. 50 Para Brigade in the south reinforced Jhangar and Naushera garrisons and set up defences in these towns. Jhangar was a crucial town the Indian side had captured because this was the town that connected Mirpur and Kotli, both towns currently under enemy control. For the enemy, not having control of this town meant they could not communicate or reinforce each other in case of attack on either of them. Strategically, it was crucial for the enemy to have control of Jhangar. For the Indian side, securing the line of communication from Jammu and up was crucial to sustain the war effort and the link up to Poonch. After securing Jhangar, the Indian side left some troops in its defense, and the remaining moved ahead with their plan of going up the towns leading up to Poonch. They concentrated their operations around Naushera. The enemy seized on this opportunity, and on December 24, 1947, they launched coordinated attacks on various defensive positions at Jhangar in high numbers. In a smart tactical move, the enemy anticipated a possible reinforcement attempt from Naushera to Jhangar from the Indian side, so they sent in some troops to block the Jhangar-Naushera highway to stop or even delay any such reinforcement attempts. The plan of the enemy was successful, as they overwhelmed the Indian defensive positions and blocked their reinforcement attempts from Naushera. After a very tough battle at Jhangar, the Indian side had to retreat from the town. The loss of the crucial town of Jhangar on December 24, 1947 was a major setback for the Indian armed forces. The enemy, with its recent success, grew bold and made an attempt at capturing Naushera, but with strong build-up from the Indian side over there, the attempt was foiled on December 26, 1947. The Indian side, after suffering the recent loss, reinforced their numbers in the region in the coming weeks to retake Jhangar. Brigadier Muhammad Usman of 50 Para Brigade was leading the effort to attack Jhangar and made the assessment that the feature of Kot, 8 kilometers northeast of Naushera, was the crucial first step to capture to attain an upper hand in the battle for Jhangar. They planned Operation Kipper for the battle of capturing Kot as a precursor to retaking of Jhangar. Operation Kipper was launched and was extremely successful. After a fierce fight, Kot was taken. This victory acted as a huge morale booster for the 50 Para Brigade, who were still low after the loss of Jhangar. After losing Kot to the Indian side, the enemy attempted their second attack on Naushera with increased numbers and ferocity and even better coordination than their previous attempt on the town. Even though Brigadier Usman had reports on an imminent attack coming in, the enemy was still able to achieve surprise by crawling up simultaneously at all vital points at Naushera in the night of 5th and 6th February 1948. The attack came in from two sides from the south, one from the north of Naushera, as well as at the feature of Kot. In the north, the full fury of the attack fell on the vital point of Taidhar held by one Rajput. This was the highest feature in the area, and hence gaining access to the feature was crucial for either side to dominate the battle. The fall of this feature would have made the defense of Naushera untenable for the Indian side. The enemy put all its efforts into gaining this feature and attacked in multiple waves at the Indian defensive positions. One of the crucial fights took place at post number 2, guarded by far fewer troops, defending against multiple waves of attacks by the enemy. Brigadier Usman came to know about the attack on this feature and sent 3 Rajput to relieve them. The troops at the feature, however, had to stop their post from being run over till they were relieved by 3 Rajput. The troops at post number 2, facing the most fierce attack from the enemy, fought valiantly and successfully prevented their post from being taken over. By the time reinforcements arrived, out of 27 troops guarding the post, 24 were either badly wounded or had lost their lives. Lieutenant Kishan Singh Rathod, who led the company during this crucial time, was awarded the Mahavir Chakra, India's second highest military honor. Nayak Jadunath Singh of One Rajput fought valiantly during this attack at post number 2 and sacrificed his life protecting his post. He was posthumously awarded the Paramveer Chakra, India's highest military honor. 3 Rajput reached Taidhar just in time to stop the crucial feature from being overrun by the enemy. The multiple waves of attacks at Naushera were foiled by 50 Para Brigade of the Indian Armed Forces. With their foiled attempt at Naushera, and the Indian side having secured Kot, the crucial feature to launch towards Jhangar, the enemy knew the Indian side would make an attempt to recapture Jhangar. So they strengthened their defenses in Jhangar to thwart such an attempt. The Indian side started planning the retake of Jhangar, codenamed Operation Vijay.
In Part 4A of the 1947 India-Pakistan War, we saw how the Indian Defence Forces were able to secure Naushera by pushing the enemy out of the town and all the important features surrounding it. The Indian Armed Forces had suffered a major loss earlier when they had to retreat from the town of Jhangar under overwhelming enemy attack. With the enemy's foiled attempt at Naushera, they knew that now the Indian side would try to recapture Jhangar. So they strengthened their defenses in Jhangar to foil such an attempt from the Indian side. The Indian side started planning the operations to retake Jhangar, codenamed Operation Vijay. With the enemy's strengthened defenses in the region, the Indian side could not afford to leave Naushera vulnerable while they attempted to capture Jhangar. There was still a threat at Naushera from the north that had to be offset. So the Indian Armed Forces took the next few weeks increasing their forces' strength in Naushera by adding the 19th Infantry Brigade in the town to support the already present 50 Parachute Brigade. By March of 1948, Naushera had both 19 Infantry Brigade and the 50 Parachute Brigade ready to launch Operation Vijay. The basic plan was to have the two brigades advance in parallel axes along the Naushera-Jhangar highway, with the 19th Brigade on the right of the road and the 50 Para Brigade on the left, and upon reaching the outskirts of Jhangar, attack the enemy's positions from these axes. March 14, 1948. Operation Vijay was initiated, with both the brigades moving forward along their axis lines. Both brigades on the left and the right along the main highway faced fierce resistance. They captured one feature point after the other along the two lines and reached the outer periphery of Jhangar on March 17, 1948. Now it was time for the attack to go into the town of Jhangar. The two brigades positioned themselves along their axis lines. Forces from both the sides met in the middle, creating the center thrust and the remaining forces protecting the outer flanks. The following day, the attack went in. The enemy was prepared to go on the offensive and attacked the Indian center thrust with high intensity. Their plan was to break the spear of the thrust of the Indian formations and swiftly defeat the Indian attack. They put significant forces in the center thrust of the Indian attack, but chose to ignore the force formations along the Indian flanks. Seeing this opportunity, the Indian side quickly made a pincer move to attempt and surround the enemy. A pincer move is when an opposing force advances towards center of the troops, trying to break the enemy formations. The opposing side in response does a tactical retreat of its center forces and moves its flanks forward. With the enemy swiftly moving forward from the center, gets surrounded from three sides: the center, its left flank, and its right flank. Being surrounded from three sides, the enemy now has the option of either fighting the battle along three fronts and risking complete decimation of its force, or retreating from their positions while suffering considerable losses during the retreat. The 19 and 50 brigades made the pincer move by moving on the right and the left flank of the enemy, surrounding them from three sides. After being surrounded, the enemy retreated from its positions and suffered considerable losses. Owing to the considerable losses, they continued to retreat from the town back towards Mirpur and Kotli. With this, Jhangar was retaken by the Indian Armed Forces. Operation Vijay was successful. After the previous loss of Jhangar,
The retaking of the town was a major psychological victory for the Indian side. With Jhangar in Indian control, the enemy's easy access to the towns of Mirpur and Kotli was also cut off. So this victory put the Indian side in a strategically advantageous position in that region. The Indian forces strengthened their defenses of the town because it was almost certain that the enemy will make an attempt on the town in the coming months. The next objective for the Indian side was to go up the communication line towards Poonch. The next step for that was the crucial town north of Naushera, Rajouri. Rajouri is only 48 kilometers north of Naushera, but halfway to Rajouri, the road linking the two towns passes through a thick forest. This is Chingas. Chingas was an enemy stronghold, the base from where they had launched most of their operations into Naushera. For any chance of capturing Rajouri, the Indian side had to first neutralize the threat coming from the enemy's stronghold at Chingas. The opening move in capturing Rajouri was made on April 8, 1948, by 4 Dogra from the 19th Brigade. Their flanks were secured by 2 Jat on the left of the thrust and 2 Rajputana rifles on the right. The advance was conducted on a broader front with the infantry moving on the hills on either side of the main road, while the armor moving along the road. The Indian side expected fierce fighting for the enemy base at Chingas, so they employed tanks to be rolled into the area to dominate the battle. The enemy anticipated the deployment of tanks and other heavy machinery from the Indian side and put in place their countermeasures by placing anti-tank mines on the tracks. It was crucial for the Indian side to remove all anti-tank mines from the tracks before the tanks could safely move forward. The task of clearing out the anti-tank mines was taken up by the engineers of 37 Assault Field Company. This was a highly risky assignment because the enemy knew that the Indian side would have to send their troops to try and clear out the mines, and they were prepared to stop such an attempt with heavy firepower. The engineers of 37 Assault Field Company went ahead with their assignment under heavy mortar and machine gun fire from the enemy. Second Lieutenant Rama Raghoba Rane was on this mission when he was hit by a mortar fire. Despite being badly wounded after the hit, he continued with his mission and cleared out multiple obstacles from the tracks. Because of the courage displayed by the engineers of 37 Assault Field Company, the Indian tanks were successfully able to move ahead on these tracks and attack the enemy base. For the courage displayed by Lieutenant Rane in this mission, he was awarded the Paramveer Chakra, India's highest military honor. With the presence of tanks and other heavy machinery, the Indian side dominated the battle at Chingas, and the enemy had to retreat from their positions further into the forest. The Naushera-Rajouri highway was now clear of any attacks from the enemy. The enemy's ability to launch major attacks into Naushera as well as defending Rajouri was offset by this victory of the Indian armed forces. With no major reinforcements available to the enemy at Rajouri, their defense of the town completely fell apart, and the Indian armed forces entered Rajouri on April 12, 1948. After the retaking of Rajouri by the Indian side, the enemy focused their operations on their strength in the Mirpur and Kotli area, with the intent of threatening and possibly breaking the crucial line of communication of the Indian forces from Jammu to Rajouri. The enemy's strategy was to weaken the Indian position at Rajouri in an attempt to lengthen the period of siege of Poonch. Poonch had already been under siege for approximately 6 months now, and the enemy believed that the town would fall soon. The main attack line from the enemy was again from Mirpur and Kotli at Jhangar. The Indian side had strong resolve to not losing Jhangar again under any circumstance. The force defending Jhangar was the 50 Parachute Brigade under the leadership of Brigadier Muhammad Usman. Brigadier Usman, commonly referred as the Lion of Naushera, for his previous leadership defending the enemy's strongest attack at Naushera in February of 1948, had become a crucial figure for the defense of the towns along the communication line. The enemy made multiple major attempts in retaking Jhangar in the months of April, May, June, and July of 1948. In all these attempts, the enemy's attacks were foiled and they were pushed back due to the strength and resilience by the Indian forces deployed at Jhangar. Brigadier Usman, with his extraordinary leadership and acumen, had planned out strategic operations to capture all the vital points in and around Jhangar, forming a strong layer of defense around the town. This put the Indian side in a position to dominate all the enemy's attacks on Jhangar. The enemy got increasingly frustrated by their failed attempts and requested more support from the Pakistani artillery in one of the major attacks in July of 1948. In the morning of July 3rd, enemy's artillery guns started to pound at the Indian positions in their attempt to break India's defense of the town of Jhangar. During this attack, Brigadier Muhammad Usman was attempting to move from one bunker to another when a 25-pound shell landed near him, taking his life. With this, the Lion of Naushera lost his life on July 3rd, 1948. Brigadier Muhammad Usman was the highest-ranking Indian officer who lost his life in this war. He was posthumously awarded the Mahavir Chakra, India's second highest military honor. The enemy made many more attempts at capturing Jhangar, but was not successful in taking it. At this stage of the war, the Indian side had successfully secured the line of communication from Jammu to Rajouri and had also built enough strength and reinforcements at Rajouri. Now, the next step was to move forward with their objective of lifting the siege at Poonch. To complete the final step of the link-up with Poonch, the Indian armed forces started planning their operation along two fronts, codenamed Operation Easy. This was a highly complex operation because of its many moving parts. The enemy had a strong hold on the Haji Pir Pass in the north of Poonch to block any troops coming in from Uri. The enemy positions surrounding Poonch were extremely strong, and the southern front had constant threat on the communication line. With so many moving pieces, the operation had to be carried out with high precision and timing. This operation was codenamed Operation Easy. It was named Operation Easy to make the complex operation appear psychologically easier to execute. The link-up with Poonch could either be done from the north with the help of the 161 Brigade currently at Uri, or from the south with the 5th and the 19th Infantry Brigade currently at Rajouri. On the southern front, with the Indian Armed Forces at Rajouri, they had to take many smaller towns and features on the way before they could make an attempt to retake Poonch. These towns had strong enemy presence, making the task very challenging. Most of the line of communication in the sector was secured. The line on the north of Naushera was still vulnerable with new enemy infiltration at the forests in Jhangar. On the northern front, the task would be to send troops from Uri through the Haji Pir Pass over to Poonch. Due to high presence of enemy in the region and the enemy's constant threat to Uri from the Srinagar highway, more troops were required to be available at Uri for the link-up operation to be conducted from the north. Due to operations to retake Dras and Kargil, Operation Bison, more troops could not be made available from Srinagar for the link-up of Poonch from the north. So, with the only option available to link up from the southern side, the plan for Operation Easy from the south was given the go-ahead. It was crucial for the Indian side to move swiftly so as to not give enough time for the enemy around Poonch to get reinforcements. With strong numbers of enemy formations in the link-up track from Rajouri to Poonch, moving swiftly was going to be a very challenging task. A plan was needed to offset the strong enemy presence in the region. This was done by capturing Pir Badesar. Pir Badesar is strategically located in the northeast of Kotli, south of Poonch, and behind the Chingas forests. Capturing Pir Badesar had many advantages for the Indian side. First, offsetting the threat on Rajouri from Chingas. The enemy in the recent days was able to increase infiltration into Chingas, and with a heavy presence was a constant threat on the base camp at Rajouri. Rajouri was the base from which the Indian side was to operate further in the north, so the Indian side could not afford to have their base vulnerable to attacks from the enemy. Pir Badesar was located right behind Chingas, and by getting behind the enemy's positions, the Indian side would force them to move out, fearing an attack from two sides. Second, since Pir Badesar was strategically located at the northeast of Kotli and to the south of Poonch, Indian forces' presence here would put the enemy in a position where, from Pir Badesar, the Indian side could either attack north towards Poonch or attack west at Kotli. This would put the enemy in a guessing game of where the next attack would come in. With the possible threat at Kotli, the enemy would have to divert resources away from Chingas and towns surrounding Poonch to defend Kotli. The reduction in enemy concentrations would make the thrust from the south towards Poonch a lot easier and hence more swift. As one can imagine, it was important for the enemy to actually believe that an attack on Kotli was imminent. To make this look believable, the Indian side was to conduct troop movements, minor operations and attacks along the Kotli front, and thereafter conduct fake airdrops in and around that region, making the enemy think a major attack at Kotli was coming in at any time. Phase 1 to capture Pir Badesar began on October 13, 1948. And after 2 days of intense fighting with the enemy, Pir Badesar was captured on October 15, 1948. Because of this victory, now the Indian side had outflanked the enemy at Chingas, protected their base at Rajouri, and posed a direct threat to Kotli. The Indian side then conducted minor operations and troop movements around the Kotli region, used its Air Force squadrons to do fake airdrops around the Kotli region. This made the enemy think that a major invasion was to come to the town of Kotli, and as anticipated, they moved their forces around Poonch to help reinforce Kotli. While the enemy was busy setting up their defenses in and around Kotli, preparing for the fake attack on that town, the real attack from Rajouri went in. The 19th Infantry Brigade, coming in from the south towards Poonch, coordinated their attacks with the Poonch Brigade to attack the enemy strongholds around the town. With the coordinated attacks on the enemy formations from the two sides, the Indian side won many fierce battles around Poonch, and on November 19, 1948, the two sides were able to link up for the first time in almost 10 years. By November 21, 1948, enemy concentrations were removed from the area surrounding Poonch. With this, the Poonch siege was successfully lifted after 1 year of efforts by the Indian armed forces. With the victory at Poonch, the Indian army started preparing for offensive operations into Mirpur and Kotli. These operations would have required significant buildup of forces in the region, and the winters had already set in. So the plan was postponed till spring of 1949. But the ceasefire was declared at the UN on January 2, 1949, so these operations could not be completed. In a major achievement for the Indian armed forces, they were able to successfully defend against an enemy siege for 1 whole year. The defense of Poonch during this period was a remarkable accomplishment for the Indian armed forces, who defended the town against all odds. The towns in the north of Kashmir, however, suffered a very different fate. The garrison in the town of Skardu, despite their heroic efforts and resilience defending the town for over 6 months, succumbed under intense enemy assault.
So far, in the War of 1947 between India and Pakistan, we covered the invasion from 2 out of the 3 fronts. The first front was the Srinagar front, where the invaders invaded Kashmir along the Srinagar highway and were on the verge of capturing Srinagar when the Indian troops were flown in from New Delhi to save it. The invaders were subsequently pushed back from the outskirts of Srinagar, then from Baramula and Uri. Please watch part 2 and part 3 for details on that front. The second front was the Jammu front, where the Indian troops were quickly able to recapture Naushera but faced a lot of challenges capturing Jhangar and Rajouri. Poonch remained under siege for 1 year and the troops had to be supplied by air for the whole year. The Poonch siege was successfully broken by the Indian armed forces, but Mirpur and Kotli could not be taken back before ceasefire was declared. Please watch part 4, A, B and C for details on the war on that front. The third front of the war was the Gilgit front, where the plan of the invaders was to attack from the northern side and capture the towns of Gilgit, Skardu, Kargil and subsequently Leh. If successful, the invaders would then surround the Indian defences from 3 sides. While invasions were launched along Srinagar and Jammu parallelly, where invaders came in from Pakistan, the capture of Gilgit had a different story to it. The British played a role in supporting the Pakistani side in taking this town. The British saw the Indian establishment as ideologically more aligned with the Soviet bloc in the post-World War II era and wanted to ensure that there was a buffer zone between India and the countries under Soviet zone of influence. When invasions began along the Jammu and Srinagar front, the Indian side had appointed Brigadier Ghansar Singh as the governor of Gilgit and sent him to Gilgit to take control of any emerging situations on that side. The governor reached Gilgit and started building defenses for the town to stop enemy attacks from that front. But there were problems brewing within the rank of his troops as they were planning to do a coup and take Gilgit by force. The planners of the coup were soldiers from the Gilgit Scouts and were led by 2 British officers, Major Brown and Captain Matheson. At midnight of October 31st, 1947, the conspirators massacred the pro-India troops and surrounded the governor's residence. There were some guards within the residence who fought back, but the governor had to surrender the next morning, November 1st, 1947. Gilgit was taken on that day. The Indian side knew that the next town threatened by the invaders was to be Skardu. While the enemy was raising troops from the local population as well as waiting for reinforcements from Pakistan, the Indian side was trying to make its troops available for the defense of Skardu. With little to no troops available in that town, in either Skardu or Kargil, the Indian side sent troops positioned at Leh to defend the town. On November 22, 1947, 2 officers, 2 JCOs and 75 troops left Leh with the objective of defending Skardu from the invaders.
This force was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Sher Jung Thapa. The troops reached Skardu on December 3, 1947, before the enemy could launch any attacks on that town. They started reconnaissance activities in the area to understand the lay of the land. They also started building defenses in and around the town so the troops could be well dug in when eventually the invasion happens. 75 troops were not enough to defend the scale of invasion expected to come in the near future. So Colonel Thapa requested more troops from the Kashmir Central Command located at Srinagar. While they were waiting for the troops to come in, pickets were set up at various locations within the town. 2 outposts were set up at Sari with troops on the left flank and the right flank on the route from Gilgit to Skardu. The base of Skardu operations was set up at Skardu Fort. First reinforcements from Srinagar to Skardu were sent from Srinagar on January 15, 1948. They reached Skardu on February 10th. The total strength of Indian troops at Skardu now was 161. While the first reinforcements troops had just reached Skardu, the 2 small outposts of Skardu at Sari were attacked by the enemy 600 strong. The left flank was attacked first. They fought bravely, but were annihilated by the enemy owing to their greater strength in numbers. Seeing the result on the other side, the flank on the right surrendered to the enemy without a fight. Next day, on February 11th, the enemy attacked the Skardu town with the same ferocity. The attack was repelled by the dug-in defense forces. The second reinforcements party from Srinagar, consisting of 70 men, reached Skardu on February 13, 1948. The strength of Indian troops defending Skardu now was at 285 men, along with 250 refugees under their protection. With enough troops available now, Colonel Thapa could send his troops to set up defensive positions in the area surrounding Skardu. One of the most important features to capture here was point number 8853. This was the highest point around the town that was overlooking all key features within the town, including the Skardu fort, where the base of the operations of Colonel Thapa's men was set up. The enemy was also aware of the importance of this feature and were able to capture it before Colonel Thapa's team could get there. This would prove to be a major setback for the Indian troops in the defense of their town, because with the capture of this feature, the enemy now could do shelling at various defensive positions, and they could also use snipers to target Indian troops within the Skardu fort. The fighting to defend Skardu continued. The enemy made 4 more attempts, each one stronger than the previous, at capturing Skardu. These were on February 24th, March 4th, March 6th, and March 14th of 1948. The Indian side's strong defense successfully repelled all these enemy attacks. During these attacks, the Indian side was limited to defending the town and could not stop the enemy from moving past them to the south of Skardu. Colonel Thapa's men were surrounded by enemy from all sides now. The Indian side, meanwhile, had dispatched 1 more company of troops from Srinagar over to Skardu, called the Biscuit Column. The objective of the Biscuit Column was to reinforce Skardu, to support the defense of the town, and thereafter plan out offensive operations to repel the enemy away from Skardu. The Biscuit Column under Brigadier Fakir Singh were on track to reach Skardu by March 18, 1948. But the enemy, through their network of informers on the way, were aware of their arrival. They planned to intercept the Biscuit Column 32 kilometers south of Skardu and sent their men to lay an ambush on March 15, 1948. While the Biscuit Column was marching towards Skardu,
they walked into the ambush. This was on March 17, 1948. They were brutally attacked by the enemy from all sides and lost 27 men with 18 wounded and 7 missing. With such heavy losses to the Biscuit Column, they had to retreat from their positions back to safety in Srinagar. The crucial objective of Biscuit Column to reinforce Colonel Thapa's troops at Skardu was unsuccessful. The Indian side had dispatched one more company of troops from Srinagar over to Skardu, called the Biscuit Column. The objective of the Biscuit Column was to reinforce Skardu to support the defense of the town, and thereafter plan out offensive operations to repel the enemy away from Skardu. The Biscuit Column under Brigadier Fakir Singh were on track to reach Skardu by March 18, 1948. But the enemy, through their network of informers on the way, were aware of their arrival. They planned to intercept the Biscuit Column 32 kilometers south of Skardu and sent their men to lay an ambush on March 15, 1948. While the Biscuit Column was marching towards Skardu, they walked into the ambush. This was on March 17, 1948. They were brutally attacked by the enemy from all sides and lost 27 men with 18 wounded and 7 missing. With such heavy losses to the Biscuit Column, they had to retreat from their positions back to safety in Srinagar. The crucial objective of Biscuit Column to reinforce Colonel Thapa's troops at Skardu was unsuccessful. The enemy, with their recent success, grew in confidence. They gathered more numbers from the local population and from Pakistan's northwest frontier province and attacked Skardu again with more ferocity on March 28, 1948. The fighting continued till March 30th. The Indian outposts at Skardu suffered major losses but were able to repel the attacks. The relentless enemy attacked again on April 7th, and the fighting continued for 3 days. Colonel Thapa requested air support to repel the attack, but the Royal Indian Air Force, already overstretched in supporting Poonch and Naushera, could not provide that support to the troops at Skardu. Colonel Thapa's troops repelled the enemy again with their sheer determination and grit. Srinagar, meanwhile, after the unfortunate failure of the Biscuit Column, sent the next reinforcement force to Skardu on April 1, 1948. The reinforcements, called the Sugar Column, were divided into 3 columns. First column, with 1 officer and 70 troops under Major Couts, departed for Kargil on April 1, 1948. The orders for them was to move to Parkata, close to Skardu, and set up a firm base of operations there. The second column, with 1 officer and 37 troops, 1 stage behind them, departed on April 3, 1948. This was under the command of Colonel Sampoorn Bachchan Singh, and the third column of 70 men under Colonel Kripal Singh was another stage behind them and departed from Srinagar on April 4, 1948. The orders for these columns was to set up Kargil as a base of operations into Skardu. April 11, 1948, the first column under Major Couts was ordered to move to Skardu. The way from Kargil to Skardu was filled with enemy strongholds and ambushes. April 17th, Major Couts' column was ambushed on the way by well-entrenched force. Major Couts' troops fought the enemy through these attacks for 4 days, but the enemy had outnumbered their column. Major Couts requested reinforcements and air support, and the second section of the column under Colonel S.B. Singh was sent forward on April 21st to support Major Couts to push through to Skardu. April 28th,
Colonel S.P. Singh reached Major Couch with the objective of pushing through the enemy and reaching Skardu by April 29th. While this was happening, by April 30th, the column under Colonel Kripal Singh reached Kargil and moved forward to support the push through to Skardu. Now all three columns were fighting to push through the well-entrenched enemy over towards Skardu. Meanwhile, with limited troops and dwindling reserves, Colonel Thapa's defense of Skardu was getting more and more challenging. By April, Colonel Thapa had reported all his 3-inch mortar had been expended and the 2-inch mortar and rifle cartridges were also running short of supply. The progress to reinforce him was slower than expected. The Indian columns so far had created their bases in the towns along the Srinagar and Skardu line, and they left some troops to manage these bases and pushed their remaining strength forward towards Skardu. The towns that they had created bases were Sonmarg, Dras, and Kargil on the way. The Indian side now had enough strength in the south of Skardu, where it was clear to the enemy that they will be able to push through towards Skardu soon and reinforce the defense forces there. The commander of the enemy recognized this eventuality and planned out a daring and brilliant strategy. Instead of waiting for the Indian columns to attack south of Skardu, they decided to use alternate routes to go around the columns south of Skardu and attack the Indian bases behind those columns, thus cutting the Indian supply line from behind. The Indian line of communication ran parallel to the enemy-controlled areas for a long distance from Srinagar to Kargil. They moved their focus away from Skardu. Out of the total strength of 800, they left 200 well-entrenched troops to ambush any attempt by the Indian side to move forward. The remaining 600 moved from Skardu down south with the objective of attacking the line of communication from Srinagar to Kargil. They divided themselves into 3 columns, with 150 troops to attack the town of Sonmarg, 200 troops to attack Dras, and 250 troops to attack Kargil. This was a daring plan because they had reduced their strength at Skardu and covertly sent a majority of their strength to attack the communication line. The Indian side would still believe a bigger strength is present stopping them before Skardu and would be planning a major attack to push through, and the enemy would attack these 3 towns along the communication line. All the enemy needed was one victory in these 3 towns, and they would be successful in cutting off the Indian supply line to the high number of troops of the sugar column between Kargil and Skardu. The enemy had planned for all the attacks to go in on May 10th, 1948. The same day, the 200 troops blocking the Indian troops near Parkata retreated back towards Skardu, making the Indian columns pursue them towards Skardu away from Kargil. The attack went in and it was able to achieve surprise at all the 3 places. Column 1 and Column 2 attacks went in and were able to achieve surprise, but the defenders were quickly able to protect their positions and successfully push back the attack. The 3rd column attack at Kargil was unfortunately successful for the enemy. The enemy attacked the outskirts of Kargil, guarding the bridge at the Shingo River. All the Gurkha troops guarding that bridge lost their lives before they could even warn the base at Kargil of the attack coming in. With no prior warning, the enemy was able to surround Kargil from 3 fronts before mounting their attack. The defenders of Kargil, under such a massive and sudden attack, could not hold the defense and retreated back towards Leh. Kargil fell to the enemy in this attack. This was a huge setback for the Indian side. With Kargil captured by the enemy, the Indian side was in a very challenging position. The columns trying to push through to Skardu suddenly found themselves cut off from behind. The line of communication had faltered. With Kargil taken, the defense positions at Dras were also surrounded, and now the town of Leh, which was considered safe so far, was also threatened. And while all this was happening, the garrison at Skardu under Colonel Thapa was still fighting off the enemy from taking Skardu, with limited and tired troops and dwindling resources. The situation for the Indian side in this region was grave. With Kargil captured by the enemy, the Indian side was in a very challenging position. The columns trying to push through to Skardu, currently at Barkata, suddenly found themselves cut off from behind. The line of communication had faltered. With Kargil taken, the defense positions at Dras were also surrounded, and now the town of Leh, which was considered safe so far due to many buffer towns in between, was also threatened. And while all this was happening, the garrison at Skardu under Colonel Thapa was still fighting off the enemy from taking Skardu, with limited and tired troops and dwindling resources. The situation for the Indian side in this region was grave. As anticipated, the attacks came in on the Indian troops between Kargil and Skardu. The sugar column under Colonel S.P. Singh and Major Pouch was the first one to get ambushed. The column was like sitting ducks under the ferocious enemy attack. With the risk of getting completely annihilated, the column dispersed and retreated through alternate routes back towards Indian-controlled towns. With the sugar column gone, the only force remaining between Kargil and Skardu were the 600 men at Barkata. The force quickly got surrounded from all sides by the enemy and were attacked. This column suffered heavy losses in trying to fight back the enemy attack. Around 200 Indian lives were lost in this battle. With mounting losses, the column was ordered to retreat, and with Kargil already fallen to the enemy, they also had to take alternate routes to get back to safety in Srinagar. Out of the total of 600, only 150 reached back to safety at Sonmarg by June of 1948. The rest perished on the way. While the columns between Kargil and Skardu were under attack, the column at Dras was also surrounded. The enemy attacked Dras from two sides. The defense column had been holding strong and repelling attacks from May 10th to May 17th of 1948, but now reinforcements were needed to help the troops at Dras to defend that town. The Indian side sent in more troops to Sonmarg with the objective to attempt and break through Zojila Pass onto Dras. It was also crucial that Sonmarg not fall, because that was the only buffer town between the enemy and the base at Srinagar, the capital of the valley. So a lot of the troops sent to Sonmarg were used to strengthen the defense of that town. Fewer troops could be made available for reinforcing Dras. After a few days of halt, the enemy attacked Dras on May 22, 1948. The defenders at Dras suffered some losses, but were able to push back the attack coming from the enemy. The two platoons holding Dras, surrounded from all the sides, quickly started to lose hope of reinforcements coming from Srinagar. It is important to understand that the Indian forces were overstretched, with the war spreading out on the Jammu front as well, where the enemy was strongly attacking Indian positions. The Indian side had to optimize the deployment of their troops and air support in that area. The Indian reinforcements at Sonmarg tried to break through the enemy at the Zojila Pass, but were pushed back. With the unsuccessful relief attempt from the Indian side, the two platoons defending Dras lost all hope for reinforcements and were at risk of getting run over in the next attack from the enemy. So the officer in charge at Dras
was ordered to break out of Dras to get to safety at Sonmarg. As ordered, the troops broke out of Dras base camp in the dark and made contact with Sonmarg on the other side of the enemy. Dras was also gone. The orders now for the Indian side were to hold their current positions and not let the enemy come any closer to Srinagar. In the month of June 1948, the enemy made 4 more attempts to further break into the Indian line of communication. On June 27th, the enemy ended up reaching 37 kilometers close to Srinagar. They were pushed back in all their attempts. On July 3rd, the enemy attacked Sonmarg with all its numbers and firepower. The attack was so ferocious that the Royal Indian Air Force had to come in and strike the enemy positions to push them back. The Indian posture now had shifted to defending its positions at Sonmarg till further troops and resources could be made available for the campaign. With this shift in posture, any plans of attacking Dras, Kargil, and further north were put on hold. With this change in stance, any possibility of relief or rescue for the brave garrison at Skardu also died. Colonel Thapa and his men had been holding off the enemy from taking Skardu against all odds for almost 7 months now. Most of the garrison was now limited to the Skardu fort, where they were running short of ammunition and supplies. The available Dakotas could not reach Skardu due to its high altitude. Only the Tempest fighters could reach there to drop off limited resources in a single sortie. The Indian side provided air support to the garrison by sending their Tempests to attack enemy positions on June 19th, 20th, and then again on June 28th of 1948. The Tempests airdropped supplies for the garrison during their sorties, but the air support was just a temporary measure to help the garrison and not a solution for their challenges. The garrison was running out of supplies, and the enemy attacks on them kept on increasing in frequency as well as in intensity. Because of the fact that point number 8853 was still under enemy control, the enemy could snipe and shell at Colonel Thapa's troops' positions at will, even inside Skardu fort. The Indian troops were not safe at any place in Skardu. The attrition caused by this dealt a major blow to the troops' morale. But Colonel Thapa and his men still kept fighting hard to repel all enemy attacks. The Tempests provided more airdrops, supplies and ammunition on July 8th, July 16th, 17th, and August 7th, 1948. On July 8th, the last bag of rations was finished at Skardu. The Royal Indian Air Force was able to drop off 6 containers of rations, out of which only 4 could be recovered. 2 dropped in the river next to the fort, outside the perimeter. The Tempest fighters did try to attack point number 8853, from where a lot of shelling and sniping at Indian positions was taking place, but they could only delay the inevitable, not relieve the garrison. With food shortages in the garrison, the men at Skardu fort were forced to ration their food and other essentials. By the end of July, the troops have come to feeding themselves with food meant for animals, and 90% of the troops were now sick. The death toll by the enemy sniping and shelling from point number 8853 into the fort kept mounting. Still somehow, the troops at Skardu were able to defend their posts. The siege continued. August 1948. It was clear that the troops now had reached a breaking point. By now, Colonel Thapa's gallant troops defending Skardu were reduced to eating 1 chapati a day, washed down with a cup of tea. But they still continued to fight back, and the siege continued. August 7th, Tempests attacking the enemy again created some excitement amongst the soldiers, but this was also short-lived, since these air attacks were not enough to change the status quo. 2 days later, on August 9th, the enemy attacked the fort using howitzer guns in their attempt to break in. The attack was again pushed back. The enemy attacked again the next day with the same result. The mortar fire resumed on August 12th. The shelling was followed by a determined assault from the enemy on the Skardu fort. The enemy's first wave carried them very close to the bunkers. The second wave of attack reached the bunkers, where savage hand-to-hand combat took place between the enemy and the Indian troops. The battle continued for hours, but the enemy was eventually pushed back yet again. During this fighting, the forward positions ran out of ammunition, and they had to get a box of ammunition from the fort reserves. This was the last box of ammunition. At the end of this assault, the Indian troops at Skardu had just 10 bullets left in their ammunition, not enough to even stop the enemy for 20 minutes. All hopes of reinforcements from Srinagar had been dead for quite some time. The end had come. The men at Skardu had fought like heroes, defending their positions for around 10 months. But now the time had come for them to meet their fate with calm resignation. On the morning of August 14th, 1948, Colonel Thapa, his 4 officers, and 35 troops surrendered to the enemy. The last message Colonel Thapa sent to Srinagar at 8 a.m. was, "Skardu capitulated that day." This was a high point for Pakistan in their campaign in the north. They had captured all major towns in North Kashmir and even threatened Srinagar from the north. Their next target now was Leh, a completely isolated town from the Indian positions.
The war in Kashmir in 1947 was quickly spreading in all the 3 fronts, with the Indian armed forces trying to push back the invaders on all of them. The Srinagar highway, along the Naushera Poonch communication line, and up north along the Gilgit Skardu route. This video walks you through the details of the war from the perspective of the town of Leh. Colonel Thapa, who was posted in Leh in October of 1947 at the beginning of the war, left north with his troops for the town of Skardu in an attempt to try and strengthen the defenses of the town. For the details of India's campaign in the north of Kashmir, please watch the previous videos in the series. After Colonel Thapa left with his troops, Leh was left with just 33 men for its defense. Leh was a town deep inside the Indian territory and had the towns of Skardu and Kargil as buffer regions before it could even be threatened. In order to increase the town's strength, on March 8, 1948, Srinagar ordered 2 Dogra to go on foot to strengthen the defense of Leh. Their objective was to raise and train local militia at Leh to make the defense more reliant on the local population rather than the regular Indian armed forces. With this, more regular troops could be made available for the campaigns in other regions. By April of 1948, 50 locals had been trained to support defense activities of Leh. They were on track to raise enough local militia in the coming weeks and months to make the defense of Leh self-sustainable. Everything was going as planned in the efforts of defending Leh when an event happened up north that dramatically changed the equation for the town. May 10, 1948, the enemy's surprise attack outflanking the towns of Gulmarg, Dras and Kargil came into effect. Even though the towns of Gulmarg was able to push back the attacks, Dras
and more importantly, Kargil fell to the invaders. So in one quick succession, Leh, that initially had the protection of 3 buffer towns and a secure supply line for reinforcements, was suddenly vulnerable from enemy attacks and completely isolated from the Indian strongholds in Kashmir. Despite the commendable efforts by the troops at Leh to set up its defense, the troop strength present at Leh and the resources available with them were not enough to sustain the defense of the town for very long. The town needed to be reinforced with troops and supplies urgently, otherwise Leh was all but lost. Leh could be reinforced by the Indian side through 3 ways. First, through the Srinagar-Kargil-Leh highway. This highway was the easiest and the fastest way to continuously reinforce Leh. The Indian side was banking on this option, but with the loss of Dras and Kargil, this line of communication was broken. The Indian side would have had to take these areas from the enemy first in order to supply Leh. Second was air support. Without the highway, the alternate way was to reinforce the town by air. Leh did not have any airstrips yet. The troops had to first prepare an airstrip for the Royal Indian Air Force Dakotas to land in order to supply Leh with troops and resources. To make matters even more difficult, the weather in the area was bad too often, making this option of reinforcement unreliable at best. The third and the final way was an untested route through the cold mountain from behind Leh via Manali. There was no route that existed through this way so far. If this way was to be used, the Indian side would have had to create a route from this direction that would eventually be used by the Indian troops as an option for reinforcement. This was through a very challenging and mountainous terrain. While all these options were explored, the defense of Leh was left up to the small number of troops present there. Their objective was to hold off the enemy assaults until one of the 3 options pan out and more troops arrived to strengthen the defense of the town. Leh was isolated and extremely vulnerable, that could fall at any time. May 17, 1948. Colonel S.B. Singh and Major Kaut's sugar column that had dispersed just before Skardu made it to Leh. This somewhat helped build the troop strength, although this relief was only temporary, because a few days later, a big disaster happened in the defense of Leh. On May 22nd, the enemy attacked a crucial bridge in the outskirts of Leh. At this bridge, the Indian troops had put strong defenses to stop enemy advance. During the assault, the Indian troops guarding the bridge suffered heavy casualties and were forced to retreat. They destroyed the bridge before withdrawing from their positions to slow the enemy's advance further. The enemy now was just 1 or 2 attacks away from storming into the town. The troops at Leh, with the help of the local civilian population, were working on building a temporary airstrip to enable air support to start coming in. It was successfully completed with the means available. It was still too risky for the Dakotas to land on this strip. This, along with bad weather, made the aerial route not a reliable option for reinforcing Leh in the long term. The Indian side started planning Dakota sorties to Leh. They also started planning operations from Gulmarg to take back Dras and eventually Kargil. And as a far-fetched Plan C, the Central Command ordered scouts on an exploratory mission to find a path from Manali through the rough terrain into Leh. So the basic plan was to reinforce Leh by air until the Srinagar-Leh highway could be opened up again. All this along with the Manali-Leh option as a shot in the dark. Meanwhile, on May 22, 1948, the troops at Leh, after taking into account their numbers and resources, concluded that they could only sustain the defense of Leh for just 2 more days. That is, until May 24th, 1948. They requested immediate air support and reinforcements to be provided to them latest by May 24th. There was no other option for the Indian side but to risk sending their Dakotas and the troops in it to reinforce Leh. May 24th was extremely bad weather, and no Indian pilot had ever attempted a trip like this. To fly in such high altitude and bad conditions and then land on a makeshift airstrip that had just recently been completed. Royal Indian Air Force most senior flying officer, Air Commodore Meher Singh, took up the task to fly the Dakota in these challenging conditions. He was able to fly through the conditions and successfully land in Leh. This provided the much needed relief in the troop strength and resources to the defenses there. Another set of reinforcements were promised for May 26th, but the weather took a turn for the worse and no further reinforcements could be provided for the next 5 days. With no reinforcements available in Leh after the first trip, the troops started to get dispirited, which increased the chances of desertion in the ranks. The officers decided to pull back all their troops from the outskirts of Leh into the main town to strengthen the defense of the town as one strong unit. Meanwhile, the base at Srinagar started planning out troop deployments to strengthen defenses in Sonmarg, which was to be used as a base to launch attacks into Dras. As for the Manali-Leh link, the first column of Indian troops was dispatched from Manali towards Leh. The column had 6 officers and 151 soldiers along with some local guides. This was under the command of Major Hari Chand. As mentioned before, this was a very treacherous, onerous trek and would take the column weeks to months to reach Leh, if at all they were successful. The enemy at this time was just 27 kilometers away from Leh and was about to launch their first major assault into the town. It seemed like this was the final stand for the defense force at Leh. With no reinforcements available in Leh after the first trip, the troops started to get dispirited, which increased the chances of desertion in the ranks. The officers decided to pull back all their troops from the outskirts of Leh into the main town to strengthen the defense of the town as one strong unit. Meanwhile, the base at Srinagar started planning out troop deployments to strengthen defenses in Sonmarg, which was to be used as a base to launch attacks into Dras. As for the Manali-Leh link, the first column of Indian troops was dispatched from Manali towards Leh. The column had 6 officers and 151 soldiers along with some local guides. This was under the command of Major Hari Chand. As mentioned before, this was a very treacherous, onerous trek and would take the column weeks to months to reach Leh, if at all they were successful. The enemy at this time was just 27 kilometers away from Leh and was about to launch their first major assault into the town. It seemed like this was the final stand for the defense force at Leh. This is when, after 5 days of extremely bad weather, the weather cleared just enough for Srinagar to be able to fly a reinforcement of 6 officers and 77 troops of Gurkhas into Leh on May 30th, 1948. The enemy launched their attack into Leh on June 1st, and the additional troops available in the battlefield gave the defenders at Leh just enough strength to have a fighting chance to push back the assault. The enemy was pushed back the same day. It is interesting to note that it was very likely that the enemy would have taken Leh on May 22nd if they had just pushed harder after their initial success. But for some reason, they chose to wait and regroup. This gave the Indian side the much needed breathing space for setting their defenses, consolidating their forces, and the arrival of 2 iterations of reinforcements from Srinagar. Minor skirmishes continued in the outskirts of Leh in the first 3 weeks of June 1948. More reinforcements could not be sent out to Leh via air during this time, as they had to be directed to protecting Gulmarg from constant enemy attacks, as well as operations in Naushera region also needed troop deployment. Radio communication with the scouts via Manali were also lost during this time, with the chance that the expedition force was stalled, lost, or even worse, perished on the way. After the initial crisis at Leh on May 22nd, there was a second crisis there on June 26, 1948. The enemy had taken a couple of weeks to increase their strength in the outskirts of Leh, and with the strength of 600, they attacked Leh on June 26th. The defenders had received some reinforcements in May, but a lot of their supplies had been depleted during the skirmishes in the past few weeks. The reserves were enough to only slow down the enemy, not enough to push them back from taking Leh. The defenders were very well dug in and fought wave after wave of enemy assaults at their positions. The troops, after suffering constant assaults, were overstretched trying to defend their positions and requested air support. But air support could not be provided due to really bad weather all week. The defenders kept on fighting and pushing back the enemy assaults from their positions throughout that week. Despite all efforts being made by the defense forces, it seemed that by the first week of July, they would be overrun by the enemy. Leh was about to fall. The officers at Leh sent communication to Srinagar requesting reinforcements to avoid capitulation. Unfortunately, there were no good options for Leh at this time. Things were looking very bleak in Leh. That is when a miracle happened. The expedition force from Manali that had lost radio contact with the center found its way through the snowy mountains and reached Leh from the rear. The expedition force, led by Major Harichand, reached Leh on July 5, 1948. This was no less than miraculous, considering the timing of their arrival. They reached Leh exactly when all options for them had been exhausted. These reinforcement troops had arrived from an avenue that had the least probability of succeeding out of all the three options. With this development, there was still hope for the Indian Defence Forces in saving Leh. Major Harichand and his troops quickly moved to the front and supported the defense efforts of the town. The enemy meanwhile accumulated around 1,000 troops around Leh for their next attack, while 200 regular troops and 200 militia were defending it from being taken over. Srinagar could not provide any more help from their side for at least 4 weeks, so troops at Leh were on their own for now. With no further expectation of reinforcements for a month, the defenders changed their tactics of engaging with the enemy. Instead of waiting for the enemy to attack them, they decided to take the fight to the enemy. This was using small, low-risk targeted raids in the enemy strongholds. The plan: take advantage of the element of surprise and cause attrition in the enemy and raise the troops' morale. July 18, 1948. This theory was tested by attempting multiple parallel raids in enemy camps. This turned out to be a very successful strategy, because with this, the enemy halted their attack plans in an attempt to better organize their defenses. The fighting continued through July and the first 2 weeks of August. The troops at Leh, due to lack of reinforcements in the last 5 weeks, were again running short of ammunition, were at a point where the enemy's bigger numbers were close to overwhelming the defense positions. August 14, 1948. This was the fall of Skardu, a major setback for the Indian side. With the fall of Skardu, Gilgit, Skardu, Kargil and Dras were all lost to the enemy. Leh was the sole pocket in the north and the east holding strong against the constant assault from the enemy. The Indian side now focused all their efforts in supporting Leh with whatever they had. Dakotas were sent in on August 15th and 19th with supplies and ammunition for the defense. August 23rd, 6 officers and 58 troops were flown in to increase the strength of the defense at Leh. Between August 23rd and August 30th, 350 more troops reached Leh from the newly created Manali-Leh track. And on August 30th, 123 more troops were flown into Leh. With this, there was significant force present at Leh, and it was very difficult for the enemy to take it. With more force present at Leh now, the Indian side could not only successfully defend Leh, but also could go on the attack against them. September 6, 1948. This was the first time the Indian armed forces planned a surgical strike deep into enemy territory. This was led by Major Hari Chand. The objective of this operation was to go deep into enemy territory and locate the enemy's 3.7mm howitzer guns that were causing havoc for the Indian defenses, destroy those guns, and safely return to the base. Major Hari Chand selected his best 35 mountain climbers, got some ammunition and some dry rations for them to eat, and some mountain gear. The commandos left Leh on September 6th, trekked through the bad mountains and snowy terrain non-stop for 3 days, reached deep into enemy territory on September 9th, located the enemy howitzer gun teams, waited for the nightfall, and attacked the teams in the night, taking out all the howitzer gunners and destroying all howitzer guns over there. The team, with the objective achieved, came back to Leh through the same path and reached base on September 15, 1948. The success of this surgical operation proved the efficacy of such strikes to be used in future. The enemy made multiple attempts to take Leh, but all attempts were pushed back by the Indian side. At the same time, it was not strong enough to push the raiders out of the region. Stalemate was setting in at Leh. The Indian plan now was to utilize their strength at Srinagar to push the enemy from Zojila, Dras and Kargil. If the Indian side was able to do that, the enemy at Leh would be encircled from both the sides and would have no option but to retreat. So, Leh's objective was to continue with the stalemate status quo, and the Indian troop movements from Srinagar would take the aggressive stance. And as soon as the Indian troops take Kargil, both Kargil and Leh would launch simultaneous attacks on enemy positions, routing them from the region. The plan looked good on paper, but for its success, the enemy strongholds at Zojila Pass, Dras and Kargil had to be broken. To make matters worse, this task had to be completed before winter sets in by mid-November. Because after the winter set in, it would be very challenging for the Indian side to conduct operations in that region. The troops from Srinagar and Gulmarg had made 2 prior attempts at breaking through in Dras and Kargil in June, but had failed. The Indian side made an attempt to take Zojila on September 2nd, 1948. The plan was to attack at multiple enemy positions simultaneously, catch them by surprise, and push them out. Timing and accurate intelligence on the enemy positions were very crucial for this operation's success. Due to incomplete information on enemy positions in Zojila, some teams made contact with the enemy earlier than the rest, and the element of surprise was lost. They were not able to push the deeply dug-in enemy back. The enemy knew the importance of keeping Zojila Pass and had made all the preparations not to give up their positions. The Indian side made the next attempt at taking Zojila on September 13th, with the objective of taking all important features around the enemy positions and then using those features to push the enemy out of Zojila. The attack went in but ended in a fiasco. The enemy pinned down the Indian troops attempting to capture the features. The Indian side suffered heavy losses, with 23 killed in action and 67 wounded, and had to retreat from their positions. So 2 attempts had been made in taking Zojila Pass in September itself, and both had been unsuccessful. The winters were quickly approaching, and it was crucial to take Zojila, Dras, and reach Kargil before mid-November if the Indian side wanted to secure Leh. The strategy of leveraging infantry movements along with air support had failed multiple times. This was a time for some creative problem solving for the Indian military strategists. The planners came up with a creative yet highly risky plan. This plan was to bring in tanks into the battlefield in that region. This was a highly risky plan because tanks had never been used at such altitude and cold weather in Kashmir, and there was no way of knowing whether the Indian tanks would be able to perform as expected in these trying conditions. And even if tanks functioned at those temperatures, there were no tracks available for the tanks to even roll in. The Indian side would have had to first build the tracks before any tanks could be even used. The tracks would need to be built under enemy threat, and the last mile to the enemy would have to be traversed without a track. And in case that was not enough, adding another level of complexity to this plan, all this was to be accomplished in total secrecy. This means that building the tracks as well as transporting the heavy tanks into the region, all was required to be done in secret. The enemy, under no circumstances, could know that the army was planning to deploy tanks on the battlefield. Otherwise, in response, they would arrange for anti-tank equipment from their supply routes and deploy them to thwart the attack. The surprise, if achieved, would have to be a major achievement, since any major tank deployment or tank track building would be easily noticeable for the enemy informers in the region. Despite all the potential pitfalls with this plan, it was the best chance that Indian side had to break the enemy's triangle of Zojila Pass, Dras, and Kargil. If they were able to achieve all these conditions required for the tanks to roll in as a surprise, that would give a very high likelihood of victory for the Indian side. The operation was given the green light with the code name Operation Bison. The Indian side launched Operation Bison to push back the enemy from Zojila, Dras, and Kargil to relieve Leh. The first step for this operation was diversion. In a typical bait and switch style, the Indian side started troop movements and small skirmishes with the enemy as a diversionary tactic. The plan was to focus the enemy's attention on these skirmishes, making them believe that another attack may be coming in at those positions. All the while, the army engineers built the tank tracks into the battlefield. The army engineers started building the tracks and bridges on the route from Srinagar to Zojila as close as possible to the enemy positions. And for the tanks, the Indian side had to hide the tank movements from the informers present in the region. So they dismantled the tanks, camouflaged the pieces, and moved them using different routes and varying modes of transport into Gulmarg. The hope was that with the movement of tank pieces through different routes, no one will be able to connect the dots on this, and the plan to bring tanks into the battlefield would remain a secret until the very end. All resources from the Air Force were made available for this high priority operation. All the tracks and bridges were prepared for tanks to move in by October 15, 1948. The tanks were also assembled and all ready to go at Gulmarg. There was no way to know whether or not surprise had been achieved before the launch of Operation Bison. If the enemy was found to have implemented anti-tank measures, that would indicate that the surprise element was lost and the objective would be all the more difficult to achieve. The Indian side was ready to launch Operation Bison on October 22, 1948. The attack was all set to go in when a snowstorm hit the region, and all major troop movements and operations had to be halted till the weather got better. November 1st, 1948, the weather and tracks cleared up and the Indian side launched Operation Bison. This was the time for the reality check. The tanks moved ahead on the tracks. No anti-tank measures were found on the tracks. The element of surprise had been achieved. The enemy was found completely shocked with the presence of tanks in the assault, and they were quickly routed from their dug-in positions and were forced to retreat. The retreat of the enemy was also not made easy by the Indian side, where the infantry units chased the enemy to ensure the complete rout and keep the momentum going. The Air Force constantly bombing enemy positions during their retreat as well. Within the next few days, Dras was taken in a similar fashion, and by November 24th, the final assault of Kargil was completed with the Indian retaking of Kargil from the enemy. With Kargil in Indian control and with Leh having strong numbers present with them, the Indian side launched simultaneous attacks on enemy positions between Kargil and Leh. The enemy, surrounded by both sides, quickly fled the battle scene, leaving all the stockpiled ammo behind. With this, Operation Bison was successful. A lot needs to be said about the grit and determination of the troops of the Indian campaign in the north, especially in Skardu and Leh. The troops fought off enemies larger in numbers and better equipped for such a long duration. The defenders of Leh in the beginning were just 33 in strength. They trained local militia to strengthen their defenses, made a makeshift airstrip for the Dakotas to land, and held off the enemy to buy enough time for reinforcements from Manali or by air to arrive. In the end, when there was parity of numbers with the enemy, they showed superior strategy and tactics, and with the help of Operation Bison, they were able to rout the enemy from the crucial towns east of Srinagar. In the end, a UN-brokered ceasefire was declared on January 1st, 1949, where India had taken back 2/3 of the region and Pakistan had 1/3. This was the moment in the war where Indian strength had increased in all the regions, and it was in a place to engage with the enemy from a position of strength. Plans were laid out for operations to commence in spring of 1949, but the UN-brokered ceasefire halted these plans. The Indian armed forces fought off a determined enemy militia in higher numbers to protect Kashmir from invasion. With ever-changing scenarios during the war, the Indian armed forces were able to quickly adapt and achieve their objectives. The soldiers on the field went above and beyond to perform their duties.